Hi there, I'm Ben, and I'll be presenting on behalf of Group 2B the topic of supply chain governance. I hope by the end of this presentation there'll be some interesting examples to ensure, along with the handout, that this important facet of supply chains is well covered. Firstly, we will cover introduction to transaction costs, the dimensions, the governance, and then finally conclude right before you start falling asleep. Okay, so let's talk about transaction costs, or TC. So we're now all familiar with this diagram. The official definition of supply chains is the efficient and effective flow of products, information, and financials from the supplier's supplier through the various intermediary organizations out to the final consumer. Let's understand what is cost. It would be a good idea to pay more attention to this part, as we'll be discussing more about it in the next slide. Costs are the resources used to make a product, and they are expressed in motionary terms, or one can say the cost which took place in undertaking an economic exchange. Also to note that the cost comprises of production cost and transaction cost. These transaction costs are classified as being high, medium, and low. The aim of a company should be to always work on reducing transaction costs. This will in turn reduce the supply chain costs. So if we started governing transaction costs, we would be governing supply chain, and governance would help in lowering both. So how does governance help to reduce transaction costs? It's done by ensuring right governance through efficient contracts to optimize the transaction cost. And how does governance help to reduce supply chain costs? By ensuring good governance of transactional cost, the transaction risk is reduced, and hence a more efficient supply chain. These fine gentlemen you see here are Oliver Williamson on the left and Ronald Coase on the right, the two minds behind the transaction cost theory. Williamson explained that all types of governance is largely divided into three types of contracts, which are classical, neoclassical, and relational. These were based on Ronald Coase, who said transaction costs only occurred when more than one person was engaged in a transaction. We already understand the prisoner's dilemma, and the correlation here is to look at the transaction cost as rationality and opportunism. Bounded rationality. A rational behavior is limited to the ability of the decision makers to exchange information rationally. In the above case, the information given was bounded, as there was no way to find out what other prisoner was thinking. Opportunism is guided by the considerations of self-interest with guile. This includes behaviors such as cheating, lying, and subtle forms of violation of agreements. In the above case, the prisoner took the offer which was in best interest for them personally. The dimensions of transaction cost are divided into three parts: asset specificity, frequency, and uncertainty. Here's a short video to explain these three terms. Asset specificity, uncertainty, and frequency form the key components or dimensions of transaction cost theory. I'll explain these three dimensions. The asset's specificity is the transferability of assets that support a given transaction. It can be human or physical specificity. At what point are transaction-specific expenses encountered? Here's an example. Let's say a manufacturer is offered a contract to build a new gadget that turns grapes into wine. It requires unique, expensive materials and is super complex. A new and expensive machine must be custom built just to supply the manufacturer for this new gadget. These companies are effectively stuck with each other. Also, The wine gadget manufacturer must rely on a single customer to order sufficient quantities to make that machine profitable. And the buyer of the new gadget is reliant on a single supplier for its new wine gadget and is unable to compare prices and quality among various sources. Negotiations for such a contract would probably rely on a long-term commitment that protect both parties. Secondly, there is the uncertainty. It's the threat of opportunisms. Transactions with unanticipated changes. This can be environmental uncertainty or behavioural uncertainty. We don't have a glass ball to predict the future, but we can classify the uncertainty level. It can be an uncertainty of quality, reliable supply, timeliness, or of quantity. Transactions that require commitment over a longer period of time, like the manufacturing of our wine gadget, will experience higher forms of uncertainty. Finally, the frequency. Are these transactions occasional, or are they more recurrent? Will this wine gadget become revolutionary? Will there be an ongoing relationship built between manufacturer and buyer? These three dimensions will all determine the governance needed. Finally, the governance of transaction costs. This serves in an important function to make sure every party's interest is taken care of without opportunisms. Therefore, they are needed to decrease opportunism and create confidence in the transaction, which simply put means to reduce the risk in transactions. There are 4 types of governance structures of transaction costs: market governance, bilateral governance, trilateral governance, and unified governance. Now, as we have understood the dimensions and what type of governance there are, we need to understand their linkages. So please look at Figure 2 on page 4 of the handout. The upcoming slides would be illustrated examples of market governance and how it plays in each scenario. Let's look at an example of market governance. In this scenario, the uncertainty is the constant, and we are talking about commodity and apple. There is no specific demand for an apple, as the customer has many choices of where to buy an apple, and the seller can sell apples from different locations. Now let's look at the next scenario in this context. This shows a successful implementation of the above model, and these companies, Amazon and Alibaba, have both removed uncertainty, as they have directly created a link with the customer by removing the uncertainty. Now let's look at trilateral governance. For example, the installation of a new lift in a commercial building. There are 3 parties involved in this scenario. Party 1, the building owner. Party 2, the business owners on each floor. And the third party, the lift provider. Adding a new party into the mix has created more uncertainty due to the involvement of more parties. And due to less frequency, this would increase risk, which would mean higher transaction costs. For an example of bilateral governance, in this case, the builder makes multiple buildings. He installs lifts in each of his buildings and deals with the lift provider directly. This has high frequency, with same specificity, but the transaction costs would be low, as there would be lesser risk involved. The sale of Apple products fall under unified governance. A person who chooses Apple computers is generally within their ecosystem, with a very high specificity, and the sales happen on a high frequency. As Apple's model to create hardware and software both in-house, it would mean less uncertainty. Apple reduced their transaction costs this year by moving to unified governance from bilateral governance, by announcing that they would move from using Intel's CPUs to using their own CPUs in their computers. This would reduce their transaction costs, as they would have lesser dependency in creating their product. And for this scenario, you can see Intel moving from bilateral governance to market governance. Rather Intel selling their products only as a component, they now tie up with companies such as IBM and HP to sell their braided products through off-the-shelf, pre-bundled offerings. Righty-ho, we're nearly there. Time to conclude. There are 4 types of governance: market, bilateral, trilateral, and unified, and they are divided by 2 types of frequencies. Where market governance has both occasional and recurrent, trilateral has only occasional, and bilateral and unified under recurrent frequency. Also note, they each have a specific contracting. Market, classical, trilateral, neoclassical, bilateral and unified, relational. The occurrence of transaction cost, dimensions of transaction cost, and governance of transaction cost create a transaction cost framework, which is a key basis for supply chain governance. Awesome, thank you for your time. We hope you learned something about supply chain governance with the help from Group 2B.